So we are E101 Section 9, Group 15, the canoe crew. So the first part of our design process was to ask questions about the project. So things like, what were the constraints of our canoe? What's it supposed to do? What can we make it do? What can we do to make it do that? And what has worked well for previous groups that have done this before? And basically the constraints, there was some size constraints, and there were a few materials that were banned. It's supposed to float, so the objective to get it to float is to have a buoyancy less than water, or density, sorry. And through our research, we figured out that a foam mold has worked well for past groups. So the next step was to imagine. So we needed to think about what we wanted our canoe to look like in the end. What shape and design can we use to our advantage, and what types of materials would work best for our both the functionality and the cosmetics of the canoe. And we determined that it had to have both a nicely shaped bow and stern, and we wanted to have a relatively smooth surface. For our materials, we decided on a kickboard as our aggregate because it has a very low density, and that was put in there to help the concrete float.
So our next step is research, and we asked what are the best components that would make our mix buoyant, how can we shape our mold in a way that can support our concrete, and what is the most effective type of mold that we can create in an efficient manner. As for the best components that would make our mix buoyant, we decided on making a mix of concrete, water, and tiny bits of kickboard in a ratio of 1 to 1 to 1. And we drew out and cut out a styrofoam mold that supported our concrete canoe, and we believe it is the most effective type of mold because it's much easier to handle and it's easier to measure and create the mold.
The next phase in our design process was to plan. So the first part of it was determining the building materials that we would need for to ensure that the canoe could float in place in water. So we decided to use ground up kickboard as an aggregate. Along with that, we used the normal combinations of Portland cement and water in a 1:1 ratio. And we found with our size plan that it would be able to float in water as the density on the inside would be less than 1. And also with the plan and the size of it, we had to ensure that it fit within the FEDD guidelines. So we had to follow the size constraints and ensure that the materials weren't anything that was restricted. The next step for our design process would be to improve the design and determine what we can do with it. So we had to find a way to test it, ensure that things well. So we mainly did that, but just by placing it in water and seeing how much it could hold in weight, and ensure that it still floated. And to pass that point to improve it, to ensure that it floated more effectively, we could essentially just shave off and cut off part of it to make it less thick in certain areas, so that it's more consistent and it would be less dense, so it could be buoyant.
So during our FEDD design process, we had two main challenges. Our first challenge was how can we make the curves on AutoCAD? So Matthew was really the head guy for AutoCAD, but he was having trouble with making the curves on the front and the back of the boat. And we reached out to get help, but nobody could quite figure it out. So we just decided to change our process up and make the mold out of styrofoam. And our second challenge was how long do we need to cure the canoe for? So we needed to find a way to cure it for the optimal time while also having enough time to design and plan for the canoe. And so we decided that we needed to cure the canoe for as long as possible. As long as we felt like we had a solid design going into constructing the canoe, then curing it for as long as possible would give us the best chance for success.
So the next step in our design process was to create. So the first thing was to come up with an effective strategy for the construction. So we did all of that in the design. And so from there, we just had to cut the mold, right? And that was pretty easy because we had our nice, neat, drawn out designs. And we were able to just put those on to our styrofoam and cut it out pretty easily on a bandsaw, then a little bit by hand sanding it down. After that, we had to create the concrete mix, right? So we took our kickboard that we cut up and our cement and our water. We used equal parts of those, mixing them up in a 3-gallon bucket that was inside of a 5-gallon bucket to contain the mess with a mixing rod that you use for concrete. And then after that, just paste that mix onto the mold, using a couple putty knives and such to mold it up real nice, get it as smooth as possible. So once we did that, we got it as smooth as possible. We were able to then just let it sit, dry out for a while, did the 28-day curing process. Once that was finished, took some metal putty knives in it, ripped out what we could with just our hands, and then from there, used that to take all the styrofoam out from the inside of the actual canoe. And then we're left with our canoe we were able to attest. All right, so this is just a couple photos going through our whole design process. So right here is our section photo, just seeing the side view of it. That's where the actual mold is, that's where the canoe is. That's the plan view, all right, bird's eye view. You can see, again, both things on there. So this is me cutting up the kickboard, just to be able to use so we can get our aggregate from that. So we used a bandsaw for that. Also used a food processor, and then used an even smaller food processor, and obviously it made a mess. There's me cutting out the styrofoam design as we explained, and it went pretty easily. That's what it ended up being. And after a little sanding down, we got some smooth edges, like what we wanted. There's mixing it up and applying the actual concrete onto the bowl. And there's just a couple more photos of applying it.
So my bit of advice would be don't waste a week and a half working on a 3D model. That's not going to work. And also don't wait until literally FEDD day to test your project. That's not good.
So a bit of advice that I'd personally give would be to develop a plan early and make sure that the ideas you're implementing in the plan are actually feasible to build and create, especially within the time frame that you have.
One thing we could have done differently was test it multiple times beforehand. Seeing as that it was a concrete canoe, it took a while to cure, and we didn't really have much time to test it beforehand. And I think testing it out and seeing what could have been done to improve upon it would